Welcome back. The world's two biggest economies are locked in a trade war. The pound is slumping, the economy's contracting. Recession may be just one quarter away. Or is it? Let's discuss with two guests. Ruth Lee is an economist and Giles Wilkes was, until a few weeks ago, a special advisor to the Prime Minister on business and industrial strategy. Well, we had those pretty grim numbers, didn't we, on Friday? 0.2% contraction, worse than expected. Total UK economy shrinking. Ruth, does this feel like the start of a recession?
Not to me, no. I mean, the point was that the second quarter figure was basically a correction to the first quarter figure, which, of course, have been boosted by the pre-Brexit day, the original Brexit day activity. And if you actually look at the breakdown of the expenditure figures of GDP, you'll see a huge swing from major stock building in the first quarter to major stock building.
So it's kind of a bumpy ride,
There was a major stock building and then destocking. It was about a turnaround of about £10 billion, which is actually huge.
So no recession.
So, well, and the thing is that the household consumption was up 0.5%, which was very similar to the first quarter, and unemployment is very low. It's at record levels since 1974. Real earnings are now rising quite quickly. So combined with high employment and high real earnings growth, that should sustain household consumption growth going forward. But, of course, there will be a rocky ride. I think there will be bumps in the road. But when you have unemployment rate of 3.7%, it ain't no recession. OK. And, Giles, I mean, is there something to be worried about with those numbers?
Well, in terms of what people feel, people will not be feeling a recession right now. As Ruth says, there's not very much unemployment. Employment is actually at an all-time high. Inflation's low. All the things that people associate with economic distress are not happening right now. Wages are rising quite well. What the government won't be wanting to see is the story of a recession getting out there. And that's all going to be about the next quarter that's going to be more affected by these concerns around Brexit. Right now, that minus 0.2, it might even be revised away. So
probably will.
They want to make sure that people aren't discussing a Boris bust in the press, rather than the actual reality of it.
But you mentioned Brexit, I mean, and Ruth, you said, there is clearly a Brexit effect here. People are preparing for a possible deadline and not. So Brexit is responsible for this contraction,
yes,
at least, is it?
Well, it was responsible for the boost in the first quarter, and, of course, then you just had the destocking in the second quarter. That was the major movement. There was actually a movement on the trade figures as well. But it'll be interesting that as we run up to the 31st of October, will businesses actually stop building again, as they did in the first quarter? If that is the case, you actually might find that the third quarter
another rollercoaster ride.
Although what will happen in the third quarter, we don't know. But for NISA, National Institute of Economic and Social Research, for what it's worth, are suggesting perhaps GDP will grow by 0.2% in the third quarter. But we've got high employment, so it's not a disaster.
You're relaxed, are you, about a no-deal?
I'm relatively relaxed because
I don't think you were so relaxed before.
No. So I'm relatively relaxed because the truth is
you wanted a deal, though, didn't you?
Well, the truth is the deal is off the table because the withdrawal agreement, it's quite obvious that the Commission is not going to seriously reopen the negotiations, and it's quite obvious that the withdrawal agreement can't go through the Commons. So where is it? It's a no deal. But we're making preparations, and so are the EU. They've made their contingency plans. Trade will continue. Perhaps a few bumps in the road.
I think there might be a lot more than a few bumps in the road, and that one thing that has been weak in the economy, there's been very little investment, despite the fact that firms have a lot of cash. They've all been saying, until I know what I'm investing in, I'm not going to do it. If there's no deal, despite it sounds like the end of a story, but it's the beginning of a whole load of more uncertainty as we try to work out what is our relationship going to be with Europe, lots of other deals that need to be struck afterwards. So I'm expecting, if there is a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October, that investment figure might plummet even further, and then we might well get a recession.
Investment's not plummeting, it's pretty stagnant. I mean, the point was...
Pretty weak, though. I mean, by historical standards, weaker than you'd expect it to be.
Given they've got a lot of cash.
I agree. It's not been plummeting, though. I think you've got to keep it in perspective. Business investment is about 10% of GDP, and it's sort of it came off last year, then it picked up in the first quarter, ironically, and then it fell back a bit in the second quarter. It has weak. And at this stage of an economic cycle, you would expect business investment to grow much quicker than it has.
Right, OK, so
we're missing out on something.
I agree.
And one thing that certainly has been affected is the pound. Let's have a look, actually. I've got a chart which we can have a look at, showing you just what's happened to the pound versus the dollar over the course of the last few months, and this just since the start of the year, down to kind of getting on for 120 against the dollar. Now, that is actually the lowest it's been since 1985, kind of Live Aid era. There was a little bump in 2016. Well, but, this is a big fall from sterling
It is, and I would contrast that weakness back then. In the 80s, the economy was booming. You were still at the civil service around then. It must have been a great times because the economy was finally growing really, really fast. Sometimes the pound falls because of monetary ease, and that's a good news story. This is not a good news story. This is the market saying, whatever Britain is producing, you need to charge less for it because it's not as good an economy as before. Well, that's my view on the whole thing.
Yes, I remember the 80s very well. It started off with a dreadful recession, but we'll leave that out.
Yeah.
And, of course, the dollar was exceptionally strong. But I think more to the point, I think we're down to the levels now of sort of early 2017 when there was...
A little bit lower
when
than
Article
that,
50 was revoked. There is undoubtedly a lot of uncertainty, political uncertainty in the markets. The markets don't like uncertainty. And it's not just Brexit, it's the prospect of a Corbyn government. There are all sorts of political concerns that are hanging over the markets about Britain, understandably.
Let's talk as well. Giles, you mentioned government, and you've both been in government over the years. And Giles, just recently, I think your Twitter bio says you're recovering from 30 months in Downing Street advising on economic policy. So you're in recovery at the moment. But did that feel like a kind of functional place to be working?
It was, although, I mean, this seems bizarre, almost a fool's paradise. We spent most of our time trying to think about longer-term policy. Most policy making is about what's going to happen the next 3 to 5 years. I mean, transport ministers plan roads that will be built in 5 to 10 years. That's where you spend most of your time. The new team are very much focused on, like, 3 to 5 months. And so it felt functional, but it's difficult.
Just one very quick question. Dominic Cummings, a lot of focus on him.
Yeah.
He is a super spad, as it were. Can a spad like him, a special advisor, really change the country?
It seems to be a recurring pattern. A new government comes in, people focus on some guru-like character who's going to be pulling all the strings behind the curtain. I personally think they're total exaggerations. He's only one man amongst many. Most of the MPs are away. When they come back, they're going to want to remind the people behind the curtain that it's the Parliament and MPs who are meant to be in charge. So there's a lot of overexcitement right now, but he's only one person. He doesn't have a unique answer to all of this any more than anyone else does.